On the night of October 24, 1942, darkness swallowed the ridges above Henderson Field on the island of Guadalcanal. In the torrential tropical rain, the kind of rain that seemed intent on drowning all hope in the muck, Sergeant Mitchell Page was quietly checking his weapons. Amidst the roar of thunder and the stench of decaying vegetation, he placed a mud-caked hand on the cold steel of a 37mm M3 anti-tank gun. At that time, it was the most despised weapon in the United States military arsenal. Logistics officers viewed it as a burden, and soldiers called it by mocking nicknames. But in this pitch-black night, Page knew that this fragile piece of steel was the final line separating his unit from annihilation. Less than 200 yards to the south, the ancient jungle, already terrifying, now seemed to come alive with ghostly sounds. The Imperial Japanese Army's 2nd Sendai Division, the ghosts of jungle warfare who had never tasted defeat, were silently closing in. Their objective was clear and brutal: pierce the Marine lines at all costs, recapture the strategic airfield, and drive every American soldier into the sea. In the hands of the Japanese were fixed bayonets and a blind faith in the classic human wave tactic, a method that had crushed many Allied lines before. If viewed through the lens of a military expert at the time, the M3 was truly an ordnance failure. With a spindly barrel only slightly larger than a drainpipe and thin wheels that looked borrowed from a farm cart, it exuded none of the majesty of a war machine. Reality had proven on the European battlefield that this gun was completely helpless against the thick armor of German tanks. The 37mm rounds it fired left only harmless scratches on the panzer plating, earning it the humiliating label of the door knocker. However, in the mud-soaked theater of Guadalcanal, history had prepared a different script. Since heavy tanks could not navigate the tangled jungle terrain, the compactness of that useless gun suddenly became a deadly advantage. To get this entity, weighing over 400 kilograms, 900 pounds, to the top of the ridge, the crews had to endure a journey they called a mad ordeal. With no tractors and no trails, they had to turn themselves into pack mules. They strapped harnesses to their chests, gritting their teeth to drag the gun through waist-deep swamps where every step was sucked down by mud that threatened to swallow both man and weapon. Throughout the journey, they fought not only nature but also the constant mockery of the infantrymen. "Why are you hauling that scrap metal up here?" "To shoot birds," one soldier had asked. But the gunners under Page did not flinch. They had a daring plan that no military textbook had ever taught. They decided to make a suicidal modification, completely remove the front steel gun shield. This act left the crew entirely exposed to enemy fire, but it significantly reduced the weight and, most importantly, freed up their field of vision. The gun could now pivot its barrel 360 degrees rapidly, transforming it from a sluggish anti-tank piece into a giant handgun, ready to spit fire at any shadow emerging from the brush. This flexibility was the key to confronting the nightmare about to erupt from deep within the forest. When the last wooden crates were pried open with bayonets in the darkness, the most terrifying secret of the U.S. military on the slopes of Guadalcanal finally stood revealed: the M2 canister round. This was not a standard armor-piercing round designed to confront cold steel plating. Inside its thin metallic shell sat not a solid block of steel, but 122 steel balls, each nearly the size of an adult's fingertip. Imagine a shotgun shell magnified dozens of times over and fired from a military cannon. The moment it leaves the muzzle, the outer casing disintegrates instantly, releasing hundreds of steel pellets traveling at a terrifying velocity, over 600 meters per second. At close range, it creates a cone of destruction dozens of meters wide, scything down everything in its path. This was no longer a precision weapon, it was a massive, metal broom, designed to sweep away life across a vast area. For the soldiers shivering in the mud, the M2 canister was more than just ammunition, it was a brutal response to anyone daring to enter the dead zone they had laid out. After moments of suffocating silence, the jungle suddenly shattered. The attack erupted not with single gunshots, but with a horrifying wall of sound, bugles blending with thunderous cries of "Banzai" that shook the very earth. From the edge of the pitch-black forest, a massive wall of men in dark brown uniforms surged forward. This was the legendary human wave tactic of the Japanese army, a sea of fixed bayonets charging frantically toward the marine foxholes. The Japanese did not creep, they used their sheer biological mass and fanaticism to crush the enemy's psyche. But just as the first wave of Japanese soldiers hit the clearing in front of the line, the 37mm M3 spoke. The blast was not the rhythmic clack-clack of a machine gun, but an ear-piercing roar, a powerful impulse that vibrated through the air. Gunsmoke and muzzle flashes erupted in the rainy night, illuminating a scene of horror. Instead of picking off targets one by one, each shot from the M3 literally erased an entire squad in a heartbeat. The terrifying power of the canister shot gave the enemy no chance to hide or resist. The steel pellets shredded the tall grass, tore through ancient trees, and slammed directly into the enemy formation. Wherever the round swept, the dense waves of the assault simply vanished, replaced by a gruesome mist of blood, shredded vegetation, and metal fragments. The toy gun had now become an industrial slaughter machine. The gunners under Page worked like robots: load, slam the breech, fire, and immediately eject the smoking brass casing onto the ground. They had no time to aim, they simply pointed the muzzle into the darkness, where the enemy's screams were loudest, and pulled the trigger. Every explosion reformatted the battlefield, leaving behind a deathly silence before the next wave rose from deep within the woods. The terror caused by the canister rounds turned that night on Guadalcanal into one of the darkest chapters the Emperor's elite soldiers had ever faced. The battle had now moved beyond all conventional military rules, devolving into a frantic and bloody brawl within a cramped space. The gun crews, in a state of extreme adrenaline mixed with terror, pushed the firing rate of the M3 far beyond the safety limits intended by the design engineers. While the manual specified a maximum rate of 25 rounds per minute, on this ridge, the gunners were pumping out 35 or 40. The clattering sound of the breech opening and closing rang out incessantly like a ghostly war drum. The heat from continuous firing caused the steel barrel to gradually turn a glowing cherry red in the dark. Whenever heavy tropical raindrops hit the scorching metal, they didn't run off but evaporated instantly with a piercing hiss, enveloping the crew in a thick shroud of steam that smelled of boiling oil and acrid gunpowder. The gunners had to use their boots to kick the breech lever because the steel was too hot to touch even with gloves. Their flesh would have been seared upon contact with the gun's body. They were squeezing the very life out of the weapon to buy every second needed to hold the line. However, tragedy struck when the loader reached into the wooden crate only to feel the empty bottom. The canister rounds, their savior, had run dry. Looking ahead, the wave of brown uniforms from the Sendai division continued to pour from the tree line like an army of provoked fire ants. In that desperate moment, Mitchell Page looked at the remaining crates of armor-piercing AP ammunition. These were solid blocks of steel designed to punch through tanks. They would be practically useless against infantry, as a round would simply pass through one man and embed itself deep into a tree behind him, offering zero area of effect lethality. Between life and death, Page and his men executed an act of madness-driven creativity: ricochet fire. Instead of aiming at the enemy's chests, they lowered the barrel, aiming directly at the hard volcanic rock at the enemy's feet. When these solid steel slugs traveled at maximum velocity and impacted the hard rock surface, they didn't penetrate. Instead, they shattered or created a massive shockwave that blew the ground apart. This act turned the island of Guadalcanal itself into a weapon against the invaders. Sharp rock splinters, volcanic dust, and metal fragments were hurled upward, acting like natural fragmentation grenades. The surging Japanese soldiers were suddenly cut down by the very ground beneath them. Screams of agony rose as row after row of troops were shredded by the rain of stone and steel bouncing off the earth. It was a scene of chaotic devastation, American soldiers were using the island to defend the island, using desperate ingenuity to fill the gap left by technology. Even without the cluster rounds, the steady bang-bang of impacts against the rock continued, creating an impenetrable wall of stone dust. Amidst the fog of steam and grit, Mitchell Page and his gun crew rewrote the definition of resilience, transforming an obsolete gun into an immortal legend in the heart of the Green Hell. As the clock ticked toward dawn, the battlefield had transformed into a chaotic mural of mud, blood, and fire. The tragedy reached its peak when a Japanese Special Forces unit, taking advantage of the thick and smoke and deafening explosions, crawled through a drainage ditch on the left flank. A volley of stick grenades was hurled in rapid succession. Sharp explosions erupted right at the position of gun number 2. In an instant, the 37mm cannon was blasted off its axis, its wheels shattered, and the entire crew killed instantly. A lethal gap opened in the defensive line. The Japanese seized the opportunity, screaming "Banzai" and pouring into the breach like a broken dam. In the very moment that all military theory pointed to an inevitable collapse, Sergeant Mitchell Page performed an act of madness that would later enter Marine Corps history. He saw gun number 2 fall silent. He saw the silhouettes of Japanese soldiers swarming over the sandbags. Without a second of hesitation, Page grabbed his Browning .30 caliber machine gun. He didn't retreat to regroup, he charged straight into the smoking crater, the very spot where death had just swept through. Page stood alone at the center of the storm. He operated the machine gun single-handedly, his hands gripping the stock until his knuckles turned white, sweeping glowing tracers into the surging shadows. When one machine gun ran out of ammunition, he crawled over the bodies of his comrades to grab another. At one point, he hoisted a scorching hot machine gun onto his shoulder, running and firing simultaneously to deceive the Japanese into believing an entire squad still held the position. While Page single-handedly plugged the gap, the surviving gunners at nearby batteries fell into a struggle for survival that was equally brutal. Ammunition had run dry, the Japanese had closed in so tightly they could touch the cannon barrels. With no shells left to fire, the American gunners turned into medieval warriors. They grabbed entrenching shovels, heavy steel cleaning rods, and even empty brass casings to use as weapons. A horrific hand-to-hand melee erupted around the obsolete 37mm guns. The sound of clashing metal, screams, and the collision of flesh in the muck created a hellish landscape. They defended those cannons not just as weapons, but as their honor and their only hope of surviving the long night. Time seemed to stand still until a streak of bruised purple light began to slash across the eastern sky. Dawn was coming, the enemy of the Japanese and the savior of the Americans. As the morning light dissipated the thick mist of steam and gunpowder, an unbelievable sight appeared before the Marine reserves as they scrambled up the ridge to reinforce the line. They saw Mitchell Page, covered in mud and blood, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and intense heat, still clutching a machine gun next to a mangled 37mm cannon. Surrounding him was a literal graveyard. Hundreds of Japanese bodies lay scattered across the slope, many of them cut down by the devastating power of the canister rounds and shattered volcanic rock fragments. The 37mm M3 anti-tank gun, the weapon once mocked as a toy and a pea shooter, now stood tall in the middle of the battlefield as a symbol of victory. It hadn't destroyed a single tank that night, simply because no Japanese tanks could crawl through the mud. But it had achieved something far greater. It had completely broken the will and the power of the elite Sendai division. The value of the M3 at Guadalcanal did not lie in the thickness of its armor or the caliber of its shell, but in the brilliant creativity of the soldiers who stripped away its shield for speed, and the raw courage of those who dared to turn an obsolete weapon into a killing machine in the direst of straits. The battle on this ridge wrote a new chapter in American military history, a chapter proving that no weapon is useless if it is in the hands of those who refuse to surrender. Mitchell Page later received the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary resilience, but he always maintained that the little cannon and his fallen comrades were the true heroes. Guadalcanal remains, Henderson Field stood firm, and it all began with faith in a toy in the heart of a hellish night. The story of the 37mm M3 anti-tank gun and Sergeant Mitchell Page is not merely a report of victory, it is a historical testament to turning the tide through intellect and raw courage. Regarding historical significance, the battle on the ridges of Guadalcanal completely transformed how infantry support fire was perceived. The M3, despite failing in its anti-tank role in Europe, became a terror in jungle warfare thanks to its flexibility and canister rounds. It directly protected Henderson Field, the strategic jugular that determined the Allied presence in the Pacific. Had Page's line collapsed, the history of the Guadalcanal campaign might have taken a much darker turn. This event also marked a turning point in military thinking. The most effective weapon is not necessarily the most modern one, but the one most suited to the terrain and operated by highly adaptable soldiers. Value does not lie in the label. Never underestimate an individual or a tool based solely on outdated standards or popular prejudice. The M3 was considered a toy when placed next to German tanks, yet it was a savior when facing human waves in the jungle. Each of us has our own battlefield where our strengths will shine brightest, provided we find the right environment. Creativity in adversity. When canister ammunition ran dry, using armor-piercing rounds to ricochet off rocks and create fragmentation was the pinnacle of breakthrough thinking. The lesson here is, when conventional support tools vanish, human intellect and resourcefulness become an infinite resource. Do not complain about what you lack. Learn to use what you have in ways no one else has tried. The power of a solitary will. The image of Mitchell Page single-handedly plugging a gap in the line reminds us that sometimes, all it takes is one person who resolutely refuses to back down to change the fate of an entire group. A resilient will can compensate for a lack of numbers or materials, turning the impossible into legend. Ultimately, this story teaches us that circumstances may be harsh and tools may be primitive, but if the heart burns brightly enough and the mind is sharp enough, you will always find a path to victory.